Here we will learn about high performance computing and parallel algorithms. In the previous lectures, you have learned how to write uh, a matrix representation of a finite difference approach. We have looked at linear equations of the form Ax equals b, where A is a matrix, and we have also looked at eigenvalue problems where H psi equals E psi. Uh, H is the Hamiltonian matrix, for example. And the cases that I have shown you so far, they are toy problems, right? Because the matrix size is very small. Over here, I show a finite difference matrix with 4 points, and it's a 4 by 4 matrix, right? This type of small matrices you can solve either analytically, or you can also call a function in Python and quickly solve this. But what happens when you are dealing with large problems, the problems that represent real life uh, problems? Uh, then you have to deal with very large matrices, right? So even in this example, if I consider a 3D finite difference approach with 1000 grid points in each direction, then your nx, ny, nz, that's the number of grid points in each direction. You can see that it is easily 10 to the, each of these numbers is easily 10 to the power 3, 1000. And then the total matrix size would be, matrix dimension would be 10 to the power 9, right? And then so you have to deal with a 10 to the power 9 times 10 to the power 9 matrix. And you can see that even such a simpler problem can give rise to a huge matrix. So in this lecture, we will mainly talk about how to solve such matrices, how to deal with such matrices, matrices that represent real world problems. How do you store such big matrices? How do you operate on large matrices? For example, how do you multiply two matrices together? How do you save on solution time? And how do you generate output and store the output? The output can also be uh, large files, right? So we have to figure out strategies how to store and operate on these large matrices. And that's when we need these topics, high performance computing, to go beyond just a one processor solution and to have your solution work on multiple processors basically. And that's why we need the algorithms to be parallel also. That means the problem is divided between processors, and then different processors coordinate together to solve the problems in order to save the solution time. And let us now first look at the issue of storing large matrices. Uh, and What we will look at is a sparse matrix, which means there are lots of zeros as elements of this matrix. This is opposed to a dense matrix where there are lots of non-zero elements, right? If you have a lot of zeros, then you can actually save a lot of memories by ignoring the zeros, but keeping track of where those zeros were, right? The finite difference matrix in 1D is an example of this. You saw that there are actually 3 elements per row, and there are many zeros. So you don't actually need to store these zeros. You can just store 3 elements per row, and still you can solve your problems. So these are called sparse matrices, and they are very useful to solve real world problems. And many of the real world problems actually have a sparse matrix representation, because sparse matrices occur when interactions in the matrix are local. That means if you are one element, only the elements around that element are contributing to the matrix. So the interaction is local. So there is no distant interactions. One element that is far away from another element is interacting with each other. That's why you get a lot of zeros for those interactions that are farther away, and you end up with sparse matrices. Uh, and You can see that the problem gets more complicated if you go to 3D in FDM. You still have six one diagonal and six off diagonal and six other elements in the off diagonal in each row, but still it's a sparse matrix, so you can save on memory. So the advantages, to sum up, the advantages of a sparse matrix are less memory required in storage, and no need to store a lot of zeros, and you can also have faster operations because you can ignore the operations that are that involve zeros. Basically, you can design clever algorithms to eliminate those computations. And let us look at an example to compare how the storage requirement differs between a sparse matrix and a dense matrix. Suppose you are given a dense matrix of size n times n, and suppose you are storing some numbers there of certain data type, and you can have a lot of different data types in computing. You already know that you can have integers, floating point numbers, or double variables, all these things, and they take up different amount of space to be stored. Integer takes about 4 bytes, a floating point number takes also 4 bytes, but a double representation takes about 8 bytes. So if you are given a matrix with dimension, say 10 to the power 9, then you can see that you can actually get, and you are storing a data type of double, then you can see that this number, the storage requirement, becomes 10 to the power 18 bytes, 8 times 10 to the power 18 bytes. And how much is that? So 1 GB gigabyte is about 10 to the power 9 bytes, and 1 terabyte is about 10 to the power 12 bytes. So let us divide by 10 to the power 12. We end up about 800,000 terabytes, almost close to a million terabytes actually. So this is a huge memory, right? It's expensive and it's also infeasible just to save a matrix. Why would we need so much memory? So that's where the sparse matrices can help. And just to compare the same example, if the matrix has 10 to the power 9 rows, but the matrix has just 3 elements per row, it's a tridiagonal matrix, a case that represents a 1D finite difference method. So you can see the number of diagonal elements of this matrix is actually 10 to the power 9, right? And there are two off diagonal elements each row. So actually there's a shifted, we call this also shifted diagonals. This is sometimes also called a banded matrix. That means you have a band along the main diagonal and a band that is shifted in position to +1 and -1 relative to the diagonal band. So then the off diagonal bands, they have, how many elements do they have? They have like 10 to the power 9 -1. There is just one less element than the main diagonal band. And so if because 1 is a very small number compared to 10 to the power 9, we can just ignore 1. And for the two bands, the off diagonal elements, to save all the off diagonal elements, we need about 2 times 10 to the power 9 elements. And then what is the total memory required if I'm trying to save a double variable in each case? Then it's 8 times 3, the main diagonal, plus the off diagonals. 8 times 3 times 10 to the power 9. 9. So which actually ends up to be about 24 GB. And if you compare this to the dense matrix storage requirement, it's which was about 800,000 terabyte, you can see that this offers us a huge saving, right? So it is more efficient to store large matrices as sparse in the sparse format, but there are trade-offs. Not everything is rosy about sparse matrices. There are trade-offs also. So one issue is that when you are doing operations, it depends on the format that you are operating on. So you have to design special algorithms to manipulate these sparse matrices. But fortunately, these days in many of the packages like Python, these are already built-in functions, and you can just call corresponding functions to manipulate sparse matrices. Let us now look at an example where I am saving this tridiagonal matrix in one sparse format. So I will use a format where I am just storing each of the main diagonal and the shifted diagonals, the bands that are shifted by +1 and -1. So let me assume an index of 0 for the main diagonal. Then this I have n elements, 2t plus v1 up to 2t plus vn in this diagonal. So that's n elements for the main diagonal labeled as 0. And then I have the diagonals that are offset, and they have n-1 element. And in this case, all of them are t's, but they don't have to be necessarily the same. If the system is inhomogeneous, all these numbers can be different. But this is just an example. For the +1 diagonal, we have -t for each of the elements, and there are n-1 elements. For the other diagonal that is shifted in the opposite direction, -1, indexed by -1 here, we have a similar form in this case. Also, some matrices may not be symmetric, so these two arrays may not be the same for some. But in this case, for the finite difference matrix that we have written, they are symmetric. So even we can ignore saving carbon copies of the +1 band, and we can even save more memory by storing in that format because it is a symmetric matrix. Same applies if it is a Hermitian conjugate matrix, but then we have to take the complex conjugate. Anyway, so this is just one strategy to solve when you have a very structured matrix. But there are actually many formats that are available for sparse matrices. And there are two primary criteria that guides which format you need to choose for which application. The first criteria is efficient modification. How can you modify particular entries of the matrix easily? Or if you want to insert an element into the matrix where there was a 0 element, if you want to change that to a non-zero element, how easy it is to do so. That's one of the criteria. And the other criteria is efficient access and operations. So if you want to do a matrix vector multiplication, you have to like take a full row of the matrix and multiply with the vector all at a time, right? So you have to take a chunk of memory that represents the entire row. And in some formats, it is easy to do so because all the row elements that are non-zero are grouped together. And such matrices, are easy when you are like doing matrix vector or matrix multiplication. So there are some particular formats that we will look at. COO is a coordinate format, coordinate list basically. So you just like store each of the values, each of the non-zero values in the matrix by the row and the column index in the matrix. So you can see that you need integer numbers as a row index and also as column indices. And so you need also the value. So for each row and column index, you have a particular value. So this is a tuple. It's called the coordinate format. And you can also sort this by the row and column index so that it is easy to access. But you can see that this is a bit cumbersome to manipulate because you have to loop through each of the elements to select. When you are doing a matrix operation, you have to select which elements to take, and that means you have to search the list and select particular elements. But on the other hand, it is efficient to modify this sparse matrix because you can just go into a particular row and column and change the element. Or if you want to insert an element, you can create a space in between some of the row and the column elements where that element has to be placed, and you can just insert it there. And then there are other similar formats, dictionary of keys, where instead of like the row and indices, the row indices and the column indices explicitly stored as as integers, you can use you can store them as keys of a dictionary, and when you specify the row and column index, then the dictionary will map onto the value that you have stored. So that's another way to save the same information. It's kind of similar. Then you can have different other types of data structures, linked list or list of list, where the first index, the row index, determines the first index, and then the column index is actually grouped with the value and sorted from lowest to highest in that manner. So these are just different formats, and one may be useful than the other based on your particular application, what operations you are doing, and all these things. And so one other matrix that is very popular and very commonly used is the CSR format, as it's called compressed sparse row, or it can be compressed sparse column format also. Both are the same things. So over here I show how this works. So there is a row pointer and there is a column index. So if you have a non-zero element, let us look at the first non-zero element, which is 7.5 here, and it's at the start of my row pointer. So my row pointer is 0, and then the column index for that is also 0. Now I go to the next element, 2.9. It has I increment, so the row pointer remains the same. I just increment the column index to 1, and so on until I go to 2.7. I have column index 3, and then notice that there is a 0, so I don't actually store that. I increment the row pointer by the number of elements I have traversed. In this case, I have gone through 4 elements, so I add 4 to the row pointer, increment by 4, and then I go to the next row where there is a non-zero element, and then I again store by the column index. So there are non-zero elements for 0, 1, and 2. So you can see that there's 0, 1, and 2 for the next 3 elements. And then when I am done, I upgrade the row pointer again by 3 because I have traversed 3 more elements. So this can save some space. Also, the row pointer, you don't have to store as many numbers for the row pointer as in the previous coordinate list case. The column index, it's also mapped by column, and you can see that it is actually easy to operate on these matrices, do some operations like matrix vector multiplications or matrix multiplication, because I mean you can just take one row at a time. So if you have the first row pointer, you can easily pick the 4 elements between the two numbers 0 and 4. You know where to start and how many elements to choose. So you can take up one full row of the matrix and multiply that by the vector at a time, because you know wherein a certain chunk of memory has all this data within that. So you can just take that memory, the values in that memory, and multiply it with the vector. So you can see that this type of matrices are useful for matrix vector multiplications, fast operations. But notice that, I mean, if you want to now change an element, it might be a bit tricky to do so randomly. And also, if you want to insert or delete an element, then you have to modify a lot of the elements. So this becomes quite tricky. So in Python, we have a sparse matrix class. It's under scientific Python, SciPy. And you can see that there are different types of matrices that are available: COO matrix, CSR matrix, which we have just learned about. And there are other types of matrices in a sparse format that you can use. There are also functions that operate on the sparse matrices. For example, the Kronecker product, the cron function can give you the Kronecker between two sparse matrices A and B. Same with many other functions. So the underlying algorithms you don't have to know because there are functions available. but you have to know what format is the format of the matrices so that you can make your code faster and solve your problem in a judicious manner. And so we have learned about how to store matrices. Now let us talk about manipulation of these matrices. So to manipulate, we need, if the matrix size is so big, we need a number of processors, just not just a single processor, but many processors working together. So this is called parallel computing or high performance computing. Essentially, we are talking about supercomputers here. And the supercomputer is essentially a collection of many processors, many processors working together. And one example of a supercomputer is the Gardi cluster, which is located in Australia, in Canberra. It's located, and this organization, the National Computing Infrastructure in Australia, they manage these supercomputing clusters for general usage. And the Gardi cluster is one of the largest in Australia, and it has about 3,200 nodes, and there are 24 cores or processors per node. And UNSW also has its own local supercomputer. It's called Katana, but it's not as big as Gardi. In fact, it's very small. And some terminology here. So what is a node? A node is basically a collection of CPUs. Inside a node of the supercomputer, you can have a certain number of CPUs. In this case, we say that there are 24 cores, 24 processors per node. And when you are talking about a supercomputer, you have to talk about its speed also as a metric. And the speed is defined as the number of floating point operations you can do per second. It's called flops. And what is the state of the art in these machines? So world's fastest supercomputer is located in the Oak Ridge National Lab in USA. It's called Summit. And its speed is about 20 petaflops. That means, 200 petaflops. That means 200,000 trillion floating point calculations per second. So its capacity is huge, quite huge. And these days we are talking about petascale computing. So the state of the art is about 10 to the power 15 flops. And people are trying to reach the exascale limit, which will involve about 10 to the power 18 flops, but that's still a bit far away. And here I show the rankings of some of the world's fastest supercomputers that was generated in 2019. The Summit leads the list, you can see, and it has the number of processors. You can see like there are about 2.4 million cores in this in these processors, and it has a very high speed. It's in the teraflop regime, more than 100,000 teraflops. And then the next one on the list is also located in United States. And then you can see that third and fourth on the list are two supercomputers in China. The third one has about 10 million cores. And how do you access some of these computers? I mean, if you want to say access a supercomputer in Australia, then you have to write a proposal to NCI, the organization that manages that computer, and you have to propose your project and what kind of research activity or work you plan to do. And the proposal has to be in terms of node hours, how many hours per node you want to use to do your calculations. This is also called the service units of the computer. So this is the hardware that is needed to do such large computations. But when you log into a supercomputer, how does it look like? It actually kind of looks almost similar to your regular computer, but the interface, it's most of the time it's a command based, shell script based. You can have bash or C shell, for example, and you can log into a supercomputer using the SSH command from the terminal. if you have an account, you need to put your username and the domain. For example, for the Gaudi cluster is shown here. And usually in the supercomputer, there are two types of nodes. One is dedicated for login. When people log in, they are put into those nodes. And then there are simulation nodes. When you run your code, they are sent to the simulation nodes. So the first step is to log in. Second step is to compile your code using some of the libraries that are already installed in this cluster. And then the third step is to submit your simulation. And you can simulations are run either in two modes, in interactive mode or batch mode. In interactive mode, you just request request some node, and you can just run your code interactively, just like in your regular laptop when you do that. And in batch mode, you just submit your job and they are put into a queue, and the people who have submitted before you or people who have the higher priority in the queue, their jobs are executed faster. So when you are submitting a batch job, you have to request the amount of resources that you need to do the simulation, how much memory, how many CPUs you need, and everything. And these things are used to determine the priority of your job. These are called batch jobs, right? They don't immediately run. They wait for other jobs to finish, and when the resources are available, then they run. And there are particular scripts to control these processes. They are called PBS scripts, or these days there's also Slurm, and they provide a set of commands to define the resources for the parallel jobs. And the resources, by resources, I mean the number of nodes, processors per node, memory per node, wall time, how much time you need to solve to run the code, all these things you have to mention. This is a typical PBS script. You can see that I can specify different number of processors. For example, I am running this code in 32 processors, 2 times 16. There are 16 processors per node, and the simulation time here would be 4 hours. And I have to put an executable, and then and if my executable takes any input file, I have to put that in. And when you submit a job, this is what it looks like. So you have your job ID. The job is assigned a particular ID. It shows your username and then name of the job and how many nodes you are using to run. And this is the status, whether the job is held or if it is running. R represents running. So this is the infrastructure. How when you log into a supercomputer, this is what you have to deal with, and how you can control the simulations that you are going to run. Now let us come to parallel processing or parallel algorithms. So we have talked about the storage of data in the form of sparse matrices, and then we have talked about the machinery that you need to run this code, and then the interface when you log in. How does the prompt look to you when you use these large machines? And the next step is to parallelize your algorithm. So if you have some algorithm, you have some problem you want to distribute, and you have a number of CPUs, you want to distribute your problem to all the CPUs. So you have to divide the problem into parts and then save each part to a different CPU, and then each of these CPUs can process their parts and write the output in a file. Or I mean, they can after finishing their processing, these CPUs can transfer all the data to a master CPU, which accumulates and processes the data and then writes it to a file. So this process is straightforward because you are breaking the problem into some well divided parts, and each of the processors are acting on it. So this is called ideal scaling, or what we call as embarrassingly parallel case. So that means if your problem takes 100 seconds, and if you have 100 seconds to solve on a single CPUs, and if you have 100 identical CPUs, then your problem will just take 1 second to be solved. right? The total time divided by the number of CPUs. So this is ideal scaling. This is the maximum scaling that can be achieved, and it's called an embarrassingly parallel case. There is, and that happens when there is no communication between the CPUs. But your problem may require that the CPUs, when they are processing the data, they may need to communicate with each other. They process some data, then they have to send it to another CPUs. The other CPU has to process the data and send it back, and vice versa, things like that. So oftentimes there's communication involved for solving physics problems, and such communication creates non-ideal scaling. So you want to minimize the communication as much as possible. So your communication, so the total time won't be 1 second anymore. In the example that I showed, it will be actually greater than 1 second because of communication. And there can be different levels of communication complexity. All n processors can talk to all other n processors, which is very high communication complexity, and you want to avoid such communication. Or you can have n processors communicated to one processor. This is the second case that I showed. All the the n CPUs are sending their data to a master CPU. This is an n-to-1 communication. Or you can have local communication, few processors talking to only a few other processors, but not all other processors. It depends on, you can control these things in your code. You can define which processor is talking to other processors. And one thing to think about or to keep in mind is that you want to distribute the problem equally between all the processors. Uh, it shouldn't be skewed where like a lot of the load is carried by one single processor and some other processors are having idle time. That will be inefficient programming. You won't be using the resources properly. So you have to make sure that the load of the problem is balanced between all the CPUs. And also sometimes during communication, some processors need to be synchronized. For example, processor 2 needs some data from processor 1. But it can be only generated after a certain number of operations. So processor 2 has to stop operating until it receives the data. So that means it has to stall basically, or create a barrier in communication till the till the operation finishes. It's something like that. So sometimes during the bottom line is that for sometimes during communication the CPUs have to synchronize with one another. How do you write code that is parallel? Uh, so there are multiple options, but the one that I will look at is briefly introduce to you is message passing interface, MPI. It controls communication and information flow between different processors, the MPI paradigm. So over here you represent each processor by an integer ID or rank, whatever you call it. And it can have local variables that are particular to one particular CPU, or have shared variables that can be accessed by shared variables which reside in all the processors basically. And these are some of the commands. So the first command gives you the number of processors for the job. You can have this type of codes in Python or in C. So you can embed MPI code in Python or C, but you need a specialized compiler when you are compiling. The second case here returns you the particular ID of a particular processor. So when you run this code runs on all the processors, and each processor returns you a different ID. For the first case, all the processors return you the same number of processors. That is the total number of processors in the job. And the main challenge in the MPI is to design efficient communication protocols. And there are various options available in MPI, as I have seen. You can have one-to-one communication, point-to-point messages. So processor 0, for example, can send a message to processor 1, which will receive the message, and it can send something back again. This is just point-to-point messages between two particular processors. Or you can have more complicated communication processor. For example, 1 to n. This is shown as a broadcast communication here. That means one processor has some data that will be distributed to all the processors, all the other processors in the system. This is called broadcast. Or you can have a scatter. So you have a data that is shown in color here with different, and you break the data into different parts and send it to different CPUs. So this is still 1 to n communication, but the entire data is not sent. Only parts of the data is sent to each of the processors, right? And you can have the opposite communication called gather. So all this is all to one processor communication. So each of the matrices, each of the color components or the matrices are sent to one particular CPU, and it gathers all the information and creates a larger matrix, for example. And then you can have reduction operations, which is also similar. It's an n to 1 calculation, but you are doing some math operations. In this case, you are taking all the four numbers here and adding them and putting the sum in this master processor, just to give you an example. And these are some particular MPI commands which can help you achieve some of these tasks. The point-to-point send and receive can be done through these first two commands. You can have a start pointer, basically specifying which data you want to transfer in a particular chunk of memory, and count is the number of is the amount of data you want to transfer. If you have a double variable in an array, for example, you have to specify how many elements of that array you need to transmit. Then the data type could be integer, double, or float, or anything else like primitive data type. And then destination is the index of the processor that you want this process to send. And then there are other variables also. So the broadcast, similarly, broadcast is from 1 to n communication. So you have some start location of the pointer, which represents the start of the data, count, data type, and the root, basically. So these are details. Unless I mean, when you are doing parallel programming, then these things are very useful. Now let me briefly go through some parallel algorithm examples. One example is numerical linear algebra, as I have already discussed multiple times. So over here I show a matrix vector multiplication in 4 processors, right? So I have this matrix. How do I divide this among 4 processors so that the multiplication is much faster than if it were done in one processor? And one strategy is to divide the matrix by row. The matrix has 8 rows in this case. So between first, I give each processor two of the rows, and so on. And this vector, it can be residing in all the processors. So all the processors will share this vector x1 to x2. And then when I do the multiplication, I can have these B1 and B2 elements that are located in processor 1, the result of the product, B1 and B2 located in processor 1, B3, B4 processor in processor 2, and so on. But this is just one strategy. There are obviously other strategies. And in this case, notice that there is no communication involved as such. So the solution time in 4 processor is n over 4 seconds. If the solution in one processor takes n seconds, it's embarrassingly parallel or ideal scaling. If there was communication involved, then the solution time would be greater than n over 4 second, non-ideal scaling. And this is just one way to parallelize the operation of matrix vector multiplication. Over here I show another way. This is about matrix multiplication, multiplying two matrices A and B. and you can divide the matrix into small blocks and store these blocks in each of the CPUs, and then have different CPUs interact with each other and multiply these numbers. So for example, A11 and A12 and B12 and B22 are in the same processor, and they can be multiplied to give this element here, and so on. Another example is actually a summation or integration when there is a large number of points that are needed. One example is the gravitation n-body problem in gravitation. So you have n heavenly bodies, and they interact with each other through the force of gravity. And then to describe the motion of each one, you have to take their interactions into account, all point-to-point interactions between them, and you get this large summation over uh, uh, many planets or heavenly bodies, and then it's a complicated problem to solve. The other problem here appears in quantum mechanics. For example, if you have, say, two electrons, one residing in a 1s orbital in an atom and another in 2s orbital, and you want to evaluate their Coulomb interaction. They are not point charges, they are charge clouds, right? Because they are wave functions. So you can have interactions between any 2 points in that wave function, right? And you have to integrate that over all space to get the total interaction. So over here, this Coulomb integral means a charge in orbital 1s is multiplying a charge in orbital 2s, basically is the charge density here, right? And also divided by the distance between them. So if you have two electrons, I mean, each R1 can assume three coordinates, the Cartesian coordinates x1, y1, and z1. And then for electron 2, you have another three coordinates, because these are independent coordinates, x2, y2, and z2. Then you see that this integral easily becomes a six-dimensional integral, an integral over six variables. And then it's very difficult to solve, and particularly if you have to evaluate this over a million grid points, then it becomes really complicated. So then you can actually parallelize this problem by say breaking one of the loops, maybe the inner loop, into segments, or the outer loop into segments, and have each of the CPUs operate on only particular segments. The same applies to the summation problem that we have discussed. So you can only evaluate part of this integral in one processor, and then when all the processors are done, you can combine or sum their results to give you the final answer. So for in this case, in the parallel algorithm, you have to divide n bodies into local groups, formulate in terms of short range and long range interactions, and distribute the number of points, especially over the CPUs. This is particularly for the gravitational n-body problem. Then another example is the Monte Carlo simulation. And this is very important in condensed matter physics or in solid state electronics. This is needed to simulate many of the electronic devices that exist today. And what it does is simulate the trajectory of electrons in a semiconductor device. And this is just one example of a Monte Carlo simulation. You can have many other examples. Another example is from nuclear physics, when you have a particle of high energy accelerating in a particle accelerator, colliding with the walls of the accelerator and also with other fundamental particles. You can also model that as a Monte Carlo problem. And by Monte Carlo, what we mean is that it's based on random numbers. So you have to generate the distribution of particles or electrons in this case by throwing a dice, generating random numbers, giving some probability for each process. So over here I show an example where a number of electrons are propagating through a solid material, and they are traveling in a straight line unless they encounter an atomic location which has some charge, and then they scatter of these atomic locations and change their paths, and eventually they travel in a zigzag manner like this because of scattering. Uh, and so in reality there could be other kinds of scattering mechanism, not just the charged atomic locations. uh, there can be lattice vibrations that are called phonons, and these electrons can also uh, scatter with the phonons and change their energy and momentum as shown in this figure. And you can have other types of scattering mechanisms: surface roughness, electron interaction, charged impurities, grain boundaries, for example. And you can have also scattering between the electrons, electrons colliding with other electrons also. So the idea is to generate some random number that represents the probability of each scattering event, and then we simulate the flow of the electrons in time through the lattice, and then roll the dice, generate some probability of scattering, and implement that scattering probability and how it changes uh, the path of the electron, the energy and the momentum of the electron. And then we again propagate the electron, that is simulate their path for the next instant of time until they are affected by another scattering event. In this way, when we have covered a lot of time steps and we have simulated a lot of electrons, we can take their average and obtain average velocities and currents out of the calculation, which are important to know. And this type of simulation is very important. I mean, is very amenable to parallelization, because if you are simulating a million electron, the trajectory of a million electrons, then it is easy to distribute them across different processors, right? You can put 10,000 electrons in one processor, another 10,000 in another processor, and have many processors uh, to do these operations. And at the end, you can combine the results to obtain statistical information of the path of the electrons. And communication can also come into play over there. It's just not an embarrassingly parallel process. So for example, if you have two electrons located in two different simulated in two different processors, and if these electrons are interacting with each other, then you need to pass the information between the different processors. So there can be some communication involved also between the processors. Anyway, so this is just an example how Monte Carlo how parallelization can help Monte Carlo simulations. And so the next topic is about writing files. So we have talked about parallel algorithms. The next is that next step is that your simulations have finished, and now you want to write the information into file. And one important problem that occurs in parallel file writing is the problem of concurrency. This happens when multiple CPUs are trying to write to the same file at the same time. Then there could be unintentional data loss and modification. As one CPU writes one, another CPU can be writing in the same location, and so on. So this is the problem of concurrency. And it's possible to avoid that. And let us look at some schemes to do file output. The first option is non-parallel I/O. Over here, although you have a lot of processors in your simulation, uh, but actually they are not writing directly to the file. The file is represented by this bottom block, and you can see that all these processors are transferring their data to a master processor, and this master processor alone is writing the data to a file. So there is no problem of concurrency here, right? Because just one processor is writing in a sequential manner. But the problem with this approach is that there is a large communication overhead, right? So many processors have to send their data to the master processor for it to write. So the other option is independent parallel input output, where each processor writes to a separate file like this. You can see that each one writing to a separate file. They are part of the data. But the problem is that then you end up with a lot of files, right? If you are using 10,000 processors, you have 10,000 files to deal with. And you can still write some post-processing scripts to combine the files and everything, but this sometimes creates a mess, right? I mean, it's a loaded file system. You cannot keep track of files and everything. So it's also better to avoid this type of uh, file writing. Uh, and so the next approach, option 3, is actually uh, parallel I/O, parallel input output. And so this is the problem where concurrency can result. So all the different processors are trying to write to the same file, and this will cause concurrency issues. But you can design clever algorithms to avoid those issues. For example, you can restrict processor 1 to write only in this block of the memory and forbid it to write elsewhere. And then you can forbid all the other processors to write in that same block. So that means no two processors will be using the same block of memory, for example. This is just one scheme to get rid of concurrency. But ultimately, the performance of the system depends on your algorithm, how efficient it is, uh, and whether it enables a very fast writing of the file.